2:17 a.m. on September 23, 1944, Staff Sergeant James Thompson sat in the commander's hatch of his M4 Sherman tank, staring at a device that shouldn't exist. A shaving mirror glued to cardboard, a magnetized sewing needle balanced on a pencil eraser, string and tape holding it together. His hands shook as he held it, not from cold. From the knowledge that 12 tanks and 63 men were about to trust this homemade contraption with their lives. The official Lensatic compass had died 20 minutes earlier, so had every other compass in the column. They were deep inside the Hürtgen Forest in eastern Belgium, German territory. The trees formed a canopy so thick that moonlight couldn't penetrate. No stars, no landmarks, just darkness and the low rumble of diesel engines that could draw enemy patrols from miles away. Behind Thompson, 11 other Shermans sat idling on a logging road that had ended at a bombed bridge. 4th Armored Division, detached for a reconnaissance mission that had gone wrong 3 hours ago. Captain Morrison had ordered radio silence after they crossed German lines. Smart decision. German direction finders could pinpoint a radio transmission in under 2 minutes, but it meant no one was coming to help. The original plan had been simple. Push through a gap in German defenses, scout enemy positions near Aachen, then return before dawn. The gap had been real. The intelligence about German strength had not. They had driven straight into the rear area of German Fifth Panzer Army. Thompson had watched through his periscope as German supply trucks passed within 50 yards, headlights on, completely unaware that 12 American tanks were hiding in the tree line. Then Morrison's voice had crackled over the intercom. 15 words that changed everything. The bridge is gone. All compasses are dead. We need another way out now. Thompson looked again at the homemade compass in his hand. The needle trembled slightly, pointing in a direction that wrong. North maybe, or northeast. Hard to tell when adrenaline made your vision narrow and your hands shake. He had built the device 2 weeks earlier as a joke, a sewing needle from his repair kit, rubbed against a magnet he had salvaged from a broken radio. At first, he had floated the needle in a tin cup of water, but that spilled every time the tank moved, so he tried balancing it on a pencil eraser instead. The mirror allowed him to see the needle without bending down. Crude, stupid. Something a school kid might make for a science project. His crew had laughed when they saw it. Even Captain Morrison had smiled. But Thompson kept it anyway, taped inside his map case because the official compass was bulky and sometimes he liked having something lighter for quick checks. Now that official compass spun uselessly, some kind of magnetic anomaly deep in the forest, iron ore deposits maybe, or shrapnel buried from years of artillery fire. The reason didn't matter. What mattered was the clock. Dawn would arrive in 3 hours and 40 minutes. When the sun rose, German patrols would begin sweeping the forest. 12 Shermans could not fight the entire 5th Panzer Army. They had to move, but move where? Thompson did the math in his head. If they drove the wrong direction, they would go deeper into German territory. Fuel would run out. They would be surrounded, captured or killed. All 63 men, if they stayed where they were, the result would be the same, just slow. The only option was to trust the compass made from trash. Captain Morrison climbed onto Thompson's tank. In the darkness, his face looked gray and tired. He studied the homemade compass without saying anything for several seconds. Finally, he asked one question. How sure are you? Thompson wanted to lie, wanted to sound confident, but Morrison had pulled him out of a burning half-track months earlier near St. Lo. Morrison had also been the one who told him the truth when Thompson's brother was killed on Omaha Beach. A man like that deserved honesty. 60% that, Thompson said quietly. Morrison stared at the compass for a few seconds more. Then he nodded. That's better odds than staying here. The problem with tank navigation in World War II wasn't new. American tank commanders received only 4 hours of compass training before deployment. Read the dial, find north, follow the heading. Simple in theory, deadly in practice. A standard Sherman tank carried 3 navigation. The primary Lensatic compass mounted at the commander station, a backup compass in the driver's compartment, and paper maps showing roads, rivers, and elevation contours. But those maps rarely included details that actually mattered in combat, which forests distorted compasses, which valleys filled with fog so thick you couldn't see your own hand, which roads had been destroyed the week before. Night operations were supposed to be rare. Tank doctrine from Fort Knox emphasized daylight advance with infantry support and air cover. But by September 1944, doctrine had collided with reality. The German army was retreating across Europe but fighting fiercely. They moved at night to avoid Allied aircraft. So American commanders started sending tanks out after dark to intercept them. Recon missions, supply raids, quick strikes deep behind enemy lines. Operations that required navigating unfamiliar territory without lights or radio communication. The results were often disastrous. Between June and September 1944, the 4th Armored Division lost 23 tanks to navigation errors during night operations. Not combat losses, navigation losses. Tanks that drove straight into rivers because drivers couldn't see the banks. Tanks that became separated from their columns and wandered into German positions. Tanks that ran out of fuel miles from friendly lines. The worst incident had happened on August 19th. A platoon of 5 Shermans had been sent to scout German positions near Chartres, France. They left at 10 p.m. By midnight, they were lost. The lead tank's compass had failed. The others followed anyway because staying together felt safer than splitting up. They drove in circles for 3 hours, burning fuel, making noise. At 3:15 in the morning, they accidentally rolled into a German supply depot. 40 Wehrmacht soldiers armed with Panzerfausts. All 5 Shermans were destroyed. 19 crewmen were killed. 2 were captured. After that, Disaster Division issued new procedures. All-might operations required backup navigation methods, star charts, terrain recognition, radio check-ins every 30 minutes. But each solution had problems. Star charts were useless when clouds covered the sky. Terrain recognition required landmarks you could actually see. Radio transmissions risked revealing positions to German listening stations. The Hürtgen Forest presented an even worse problem. The entire region sat on top of iron ore deposits. Years of artillery bombardment had scattered metal fragments across the landscape, unexploded shells buried in the soil, shrapnel embedded in tree trunks, burned out tank hulls rusting in ravines. All that metal distorted Earth's magnetic field. Compasses spun like toys. German forces had operated in the forest since 1943 and learned to navigate using landmarks and dead reckoning. American units were just arriving. They had no experience with magnetic dead zones and no training for what to do when every column in a column stopped working at the same time. Thompson's column had entered the anomaly shortly before midnight. At first, the compasses just wobbled slightly, 10 degrees off north, maybe 15, annoying but manageable. Then the needles began spinning full rotations, clockwise, counterclockwise. By midnight, every compass in the column was useless. Captain Morrison tried everything. He sent scouts searching for landmarks. But the darkness was total and the logging roads looked identical. In every direction, he tried dead reckoning, calculating distance from their last known position. But the column had taken too many turns avoiding craters and fallen trees. The math no longer worked. He even considered waiting for dawn, but dawn meant German patrols. And German patrols meant 63 American soldiers trapped behind enemy lines. That was when Thompson remembered the toy compass taped inside his map case, the one made from a mirror, a needle, and pure improvisation. No one understood yet why it still worked when the official compasses had failed. Not even Thompson himself. All he knew was that the needle pointed steadily northwest while every military instrument spun uselessly. And right now, that fragile needle was the only thing standing between his column and complete disaster. Thompson's problem wasn't just broken compasses. It was 12 tanks trying to move silently through enemy territory while German forces controlled nearly every road, bridge, intersection for miles around. The 4th Armored Division had trained for fast breakthroughs across open ground. Their doctrine emphasized speed, coordination with infantry, artillery support, and air cover. None of that applied here. This was slow movement through a dense forest in the middle of the night, deep behind enemy lines, with no radio communication and no backup plan. The official procedure for a lost tank column sounded simple on paper. Stop us and establish a defense primaire. For dawn, call for help, but those procedures assumed you had time. Thompson's column had less than 4 hours before sunrise. Maybe less if German patrols were already moving through the forest. Captain Morrison had briefly considered fighting their way out. 12 Shermans could break through light resistance. But intelligence reports estimated that the German Fifth Panzer Army had more than 200 tanks operating in the region. Panthers, Tigers, Panzerforth, all of them with thicker and larger guns than the American Sherman. In a straight fight, the Shermans would lose. The only advantage American tanks had was mobility. And mobility meant nothing if you didn't know which direction to move. Inside Thompson's Sherman, the tension was beginning to crack the crew. Private Webb, the driver, had been sitting in his compartment for more than 40 minutes with the engine idling. He watched the fuel gauge slowly fall while breathing diesel fumes in the tight metal hull. Had asked over the intercom when they were moving. The second time his voice carried an edge of panic. Corporal Diaz, the gunner, was quieter. But Thompson could hear him adjusting the turret again and again. Metal clicking softly as the gun shifted a few degrees left then right. Nervous energy. In combat, Diaz was steady. He could put a 75mm shell through a moving target 800 yards away. But waiting in darkness with no plan gave men too much time to imagine all the ways they could die. The silence inside the column made things worse. Morrison had ordered strict noise discipline, no talking over the radio, no unnecessary movement, no lights. Smart tactics for avoiding detection. Terrible for morale. Silence allowed fear to grow. Thompson could feel it tightening in his chest. The pressure of knowing that 62 other men were waiting for him to make a decision. Other tanks in the column were struggling even more. Lieutenant Parker Sherman had a crew member who began hyperventilating nearly 20 minutes earlier. Thompson had heard the rapid breathing over the radio before Morrison ordered total silence. Someone inside that tank had kept repeating the same words, "Okay, it's okay." But the tone of his voice said he didn't believe it. That tank was barely combat effective now. Even if shooting started, panic could kill a crew faster than enemy fire. Fuel was becoming another serious problem. A Sherman tank carried enough fuel for roughly 100 miles of road travel under ideal conditions. But forest navigation at night was far from ideal. Constant stops and starts, low gear crawling over obstacles, engines idling while commanders tried to determine direction. All of it burned fuel quickly. Thompson checked his gauge again, 3/4 full. That sounded good until you considered the possibilities. If they drove the wrong direction and had to backtrack, they could run dry long before reaching friendly territory. The temperature was dropping as the night deepened. September nights in the Hürtgen Forest often dropped close to 40 degrees. Cold enough to make men shiver if they stayed still too long. Cold enough for diesel fuel to thicken slightly, making engines run rough. Thompson's hands had gone numb. He had been gripping the homemade compass so long that his fingers cramped around it. At last, Captain Morrison climbed back onto Thompson's tank. He carried a map and a flashlight fitted with a filter. The dim red beam was just bright enough to read by without broadcasting light through the forest, and Morrison spread the map across the turret. He pointed to the last location they were certain about, a pencil mark on a road that no longer existed. "If your compass is accurate," Morrison said quietly, "and if we're actually here," he traced a line across the map, "and if there's a logging road heading northwest about 2 miles from this position," he paused, "then we might have right out." Thompson counted silently. 3 assumptions, any one of them could be wrong, and if any of them were wrong, the column could drive straight into a German position, off a cliff, or into a river they couldn't cross. Then something else happened. At first it was only a faint sound, but within seconds everyone heard it. Engines not American. The sound was different, higher pitched. A tighter mechanical rhythm. German vehicles somewhere to the east, maybe a mile, maybe closer. Sound traveled strangely through dense forest. Captain Morrison raised his hand in a silent signal. Freeze. Suddenly the idling Sherman engine seemed impossibly loud. 12 diesel engines rumbling in the darkness. Anyone trained to recognize that sound would know exactly what they were hearing. And German patrols absolutely knew what Sherman tanks sounded like. Thompson held his breath. The German vehicles were moving parallel to their position, not toward them, not yet, but the American column stayed here long enough, the distance between them would shrink. Sooner or later, a patrol might stumble onto 12 American tanks hiding in the trees. Morrison looked at Thompson. No words were needed. They were out of time. The decision had already been made. Thompson's homemade compass was their only option. 60% confidence. 40% chance of leading everyone into disaster. Thompson studied the needle again. Now it pointed steadily northwest. That felt wrong. His instincts told him they should go west. West was the shortest route back toward American lines. But the needle insisted on northwest, and Thompson had to choose between instinct and a device built from cardboard and a sewing needle. He chose the needle. Morrison began signaling the other tank commanders. Column formation, Thompson, Sherman in the lead, the other 11 tanks following at 20-yard intervals. No lights, no radio transmissions. If Thompson stopped, stopped. If Thompson turned, everyone turned. Simple, terrifying. 63 men trusting a homemade compass. Thompson dropped back into the turret. He keyed the intercom. "Webb, we're moving, northwest heading." Webb answered almost immediately. "How do you know it's northwest?" Thompson hesitated for half a second. "Because the compass says so." There was a pause. Then Webb replied with a dry voice. "Sarge, if we die because of that thing, I'm going to haunt you. Under circumstances, Thompson might have laughed. Instead, he simply said, "Get ready to move." At last the moment arrived. Thompson gave the signal. The Sherman lurched forward. The steel tracks bit into soft forest soil. Branches snapped beneath the treads. The engine roared louder than ever in the quiet forest. Standing in the commander's hatch, Thompson held the compass in his left hand and a small flashlight in his right. He used the light sparingly every time he clicked it on, even with the filter. It felt like shining a beacon through the forest. The first 30 yards were easy, straight ground, no obstacles. Then the terrain began to change. The ground sloped upward. A fallen tree blocked part of the path. 5 degrees left, Thompson signaled. The Sherman adjusted. Moments later, a crater appeared ahead, possibly an old artillery impact. 10 degrees right. Each small correction meant drifting slightly away from the ideal heading. Each correction increased the margin for error. Behind him, 11 more Shermans followed blindly through the darkness. Thompson could not see them. He could only hear the distant rumble of engines and the crunch of branches under heavy tracks. He imagined Captain Morrison in the second tank, watching his silhouette, trusting him. He imagined the other crews, men who had fought beside him since Normandy, men who had dragged wounded soldiers out of burning vehicles, men who were now trusting him with their lives, all because of a compass that should never have worked. Thompson checked the needle again, still pointing northwest, still steady for now. Thompson checked the needle again, still northwest, still steady. He made a small correction, bringing the column 3 degrees to the right to keep the heading true. His hands were no longer shaking. The fear had settled into something else now. Focus. This was the mission. Keep the heading steady. Navigate. Get everyone home. The forest around them remained pitch black. The canopy above was so thick that even the faint moonlight could barely reach the ground. The only sounds were the grinding of tank tracks, the rumble of engines, and the occasional snap of branches beneath 30 tons of armored steel. Every few minutes, Thompson glanced down at the mirror to check the compass needle northwest. always northwest. The column crept forward slowly, sometimes no faster than walking speed. Moving any faster risked smashing into unseen obstacles or getting stuck in mud. After several minutes, the ground ahead dipped sharply. Thompson raised his hand, stopped. The lead Sherman rolled to a halt. He climbed partially out of the hatch and studied the terrain. A narrow stream cut across their path. The water reflected faint bits of moonlight where the trees thinned slightly above it. It was not marked on the map, maybe 15 feet wide. The banks were steep but not impossible. Behind him, Captain Morrison's voice came quietly over the radio, despite earlier silence order. "Can we cross it?" Thompson climbed down from the turret and walked carefully toward the edge. The ground was soft beneath his boots. He found a fallen branch and pushed it into the water to measure depth. 3 feet. The bottom felt muddy but firm. Sherman tanks could cross much deeper water than that. He climbed back up and gave the signal. Yes, Webb eased the tank forward. The Sherman slid down the bank and splashed into the stream. Water surged around the track. Moment the engine roared louder as the tread struggled for grip. Thompson felt his heart hammering. If the tank bogged down here, the entire column would be trapped, but the tracks caught the muddy bottom. The Sherman climbed the opposite bank with a heavy grinding sound. They were across. One by one, the other 11 tanks followed. Each crossing took less than 30 seconds. Each crossing felt like a lifetime, but none of the tanks became stuck. Once the final Sherman climbed the bank, Thompson motioned forward again. The column resumed its slow movement through the forest. They had been traveling for roughly 12 minutes now. Distance was difficult to estimate in darkness. Every 100 yards required careful maneuvering around trees, craters, and fallen debris. Still, Thompson guessed they had covered nearly half a mile. He checked the compass again, northwest, still steady. He began to notice something interesting about the device in his hand. It behaved differently than the official military compasses had earlier. The military compasses had spun wildly, the needle rotating continuously like a toy. But Thompson's needle only trembled slightly before settling. There was a reason for that. Although Thompson did not realize it yet, the design of his improvised compass had 3 advantages over the standard military instrument. The first was weight. A standard lensatic compass used by the Army weighed around 11 ounces. Its housing was made of brass. Protective bezel ring was steel. And the mounting bracket attached to the tank was iron. All that metal served a purpose. It made the compass durable. It protected the delicate needle inside, but it also created a problem. When a magnetic disturbance occurred nearby, all that metal acted like an amplifier. The distorted magnetic field affected not only the needle but also the surrounding metal parts. The interference became stronger inside the compass housing. The needle reacted violently, spinning endlessly as it tried to locate true north. Thompson's compass contained almost no metal. The only significant metal piece was the sewing needle itself. Everything else was cardboard, mirror glass, string, and a rubber pencil eraser. Without heavy metal components surrounding it, the needle responded only to the magnetic field itself rather than amplified interference. The second advantage was friction. Military compasses used a jeweled bearing system. The needle floated on an smooth pivot point designed to reduce friction almost completely. That allowed the needle to rotate freely and settle quickly under normal conditions. But inside a magnetic anomaly, that low friction became a disadvantage. Even small disturbances caused the needle to spin wildly because nothing slowed its motion. Thompson's needle rested directly on the surface of a rubber eraser. The friction was much higher. Not enough to stop the needle from moving, but enough to slow its rotation. When the magnetic field shifted slightly, the needle wobbled rather than spinning out of control. It moved slowly, searching, eventually settling into a stable direction. The third factor was magnet strength. The factory compass needle was strongly magnetized. That made it extremely sensitive to magnetic fields, but extreme sensitivity meant extreme reactions to disturbances. Thompson had magnetized his needle by rubbing it against a small radio magnet dozens of times to a factory needle. But that weakness became an advantage. The needle was sensitive enough to detect Earth's magnetic field, yet not so sensitive that small disturbances overwhelmed it. The mirror attached to the cardboard served a completely different purpose. From the commander's hatch, Thompson could not easily look straight down at the compass while watching the terrain ahead. The mirror allowed him to glance downward and see the reflection of the needle without lowering his head. It saved time, and in a situation like this, seconds mattered. Thompson had built the device as a joke. A way to pass time during a boring afternoon at a supply depot weeks earlier. He had shown it to Webb and Diaz. They had laughed, even Thompson had laughed. Now that ridiculous little invention was guiding 12 tanks through enemy territory. The column continued moving. They crossed 2 more shallow streams. They skirted the edge of a clearing where moonlight briefly illuminated the ground. Every minute Thompson checked the compass again, northwest, still northwest. Time passed slowly. After nearly 40 minutes of travel, the forest grew slightly thinner. Occasional gaps in the canopy allowed pale moonlight to reach the ground. Then something happened that froze Thompson instantly. Mom voices close. He raised his fist. Stop. The Sherman halted. Behind them, the other tanks stopped one after another. Thompson crouched low in the hatch and listened. Two soldiers, maybe their voices drifted through the trees. One complained about the cold, another muttered something about guard duty. The sound of boots crunching leaves came closer, much closer. A German patrol was moving through the forest less than 100 yards away. If the soldiers walked just a little farther, they would stumble directly into 12 American tanks hiding in the darkness. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the engines seemed to grow quieter somehow. Thompson could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Minutes passed, long, unbearable minutes. The voices drifted slowly across the forest. The patrol continued walking. Eventually the sounds faded. The German soldiers had passed without noticing the tank. Thompson released the breath he had been holding. Captain Morrison waited several more minutes before signaling the column to move again. The tanks rolled forward slowly once more. By now nearly 45 minutes had passed since they began moving. Fuel gauges were dropping steadily. Inside the tank, Webb's voice came quietly through the intercom. "Sarge, fuel gauge is at half." Thompson said nothing for a moment. Half a tank sounded like plenty, but given their slow progress, it might not be enough. They still had miles to go. He finally replied, "Just keep moving." The Sherman continued creeping northwest through the forest. For a while, everything remained steady. The needle stayed fixed. The terrain remained manageable. Then suddenly the compass needle began to wobble, only slightly at first. 5 degrees left, 5 degrees right, back and forth. Thompson frowned. He tapped the cardboard gently. The needle continued to oscillate. Something in the magnetic field had changed. Perhaps they were leaving the anomaly, or perhaps entering a stronger one. Either possibility could mean trouble. After nearly an hour of reliable guidance, the compass was beginning to behave strangely. Thompson signaled Webb to stop the tank. Behind them, the column halted once again. Captain Morrison climbed onto the turret moments later. "What's wrong?" he whispered. Thompson pointed to the compass. The needle trembled. Then slowly it drifted north. Not northwest anymore, due north. Both men stared at it. The change made no sense. Had the compass been wrong the entire time, or had the magnetic disturbance simply shifted? There was no way to know. For the first time since they started moving, Thompson felt uncertainty return in full force. The device that had guided them safely for nearly an hour might now be failing. Captain Morrison stared at the compass for several long seconds. The needle remained steady, pointing due north, not northwest anymore. Thompson felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. If the compass had been wrong from the beginning, then the entire column had been moving in the wrong direction for almost an hour. Captain Morrison looked out across the dark forest ahead. The trees thinned slightly toward the north. Beyond them, rose gently above the surrounding terrain. "If we get to that ridge," Morrison said quietly, "we might see farther, maybe spot a landmark." Ridges were dangerous. They exposed vehicles against the skyline, but they also offered visibility, and visibility meant answers. Thompson nodded. It was a gamble. But sitting here with a failing compass was worse. He gave Webb the signal, "Move forward." The Sherman began climbing the slope. Loose shale and damp soil made traction difficult. Louder as Webb pushed the tank harder to reach the top. Noise discipline no longer mattered. Anyone within a mile could probably hear them now. Thompson waited for the sound of German engines starting in response, for the thunder of enemy guns. But the forest remained silent except for the Shermans grinding uphill. The climb took nearly 10 minutes. The tanks struggled against the slope but eventually reached the crest. Thompson stood up in the commander's hatch and scanned the horizon. For the first time that night, he could see beyond the trees, and what he saw made his breath catch. Lights, dozens of them, spread across a wide valley below. Campfires, vehicle headlights, tents, hundreds of vehicles parked in orderly rows. An entire German staging area, the Fifth Panzer Army encampment, less than 2 miles away. If they had continued northwest as the compass originally indicated, the column would have driven straight into the middle of that camp. Entire armored army. Certain death. Captain Morrison climbed beside him and saw the same sight. For a moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Morrison said quietly, "The compass saved us." Thompson shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "the compass broke, and that saved us. If the needle had not shifted to north when it did, they would have continued northwest, straight toward those lights, straight toward disaster. Sometimes survival came down to luck, pure blind luck." Morrison unfolded the map again. Using the German camp as a reference point, he quickly recalculated their position. "If that's the staging area," he said, pointing toward the lights, "then we're here." His finger traced a new route across the map. Friendly lines are northeast, not northwest. The entire first part of their journey had been in the wrong direction. Thompson felt sick realizing it. 60% confidence had almost gotten them all killed, but now they had a better estimate from their current position. They needed to move northeast until they reached a supply road. Follow the road east, then cut south toward American positions near Hürtgen, roughly 6 miles total. Fuel gauges were already approaching critical levels. It would be close. Morrison looked at Thompson again. "Can that compass give us northeast?" Thompson studied the needle. It remained fixed on north. He could estimate northeast by splitting the angle between north and east. It wouldn't be precise, but it was better than nothing. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I can give you northeast." Morrison nodded. Then he began signaling the rest of the column. "New heading, northeast." The Shermans turned away from the ridge and began descending the opposite slope, away from the German camp. The valley below was darker and more densely forested, perfect cover. Thompson watched the compass constantly now. He trusted it less than before, but he could not ignore it either. North remained steady. He estimated the northeast direction, adjusted the tank's path accordingly. The column moved slowly but steadily. The forest gradually began to thin. The terrain became easier. After nearly 15 minutes of travel, the sound of gravel under the tracks replaced the softer noise of soil and leaves. A road, exactly where the map suggested it would be. Thompson felt a wave of relief. They had found the supply road. Webb increased speed slightly as the Sherman rolled onto the hard surface. The rest of the column followed. For the time that night, they could move faster than walking pace, but the relief lasted only seconds. Thompson suddenly heard a sound that made every tank commander tense instantly. Tracks, tank tracks, metal grinding against gravel, coming from the east along the road, not American engines, German. Thompson raised his hand sharply, stopped. The entire column froze, engines idling quietly, everyone listening. The sound grew louder, closer. Thompson concentrated carefully. After months of combat, he had learned to identify tanks by sound alone. The engines were deeper than Sherman's. The transmission whine was distinctive. Panthers, German Panther tanks, he counted carefully. One engine. Three. At least 3 tanks approaching the junction, possibly more behind them. The situation was suddenly very simple and very dangerous. To continue forward meant crossing the road directly into the path of the German tanks. At close range, the Panthers would spot them instantly, and Panthers long-barreled guns capable of destroying a Sherman with a single shot. Morrison made his decision quickly. He signaled Thompson White, let them pass. The Shermans remained hidden just inside the trees beside the road. Engines idling, crews holding their breath. Minutes crawled by. Then at last the first Panther appeared at the road junction, massive, angular armor reflecting faint moonlight. Its long gun barrel pointed forward as it rolled down the road at high speed, headlights on. The German commander stood in the turret hatch, scanning the road ahead with binoculars. He never looked toward the trees. Why would he? This was deep inside German territory. The road should have been safe. The Panther passed within 200 yards of the hidden Shermans, then the second Panther, then the third, each one roaring past the junction without slowing down. Thompson kept perfectly still. Inside the tank, Webb gripped the steering controls tightly. Diaz rested his hand on the turret traverse, ready, but unmoving. If even one German crewman glanced toward the trees, the night would explode into battle. But none of them did. The Panthers continued west along the road. Their engine noise gradually faded into the distance. Captain Morrison waited 2 full minutes before signaling again, move. Thompson guided the Sherman onto the road. Webb pushed the throttle forward. The tank accelerated to nearly 20 kilometers per hour, faster than they had moved all night. One by one, the remaining 11 Shermans rolled onto the road behind them. The column stretched several hundred yards long. They headed east. For the next several minutes, navigation became simple. Follow the road. The compass needle still pointed north. The road ran east. Nothing complicated, just drive. But the sky in the distance had begun to change. Black fading slowly into dark gray. Dawn was coming, and with dawn would come visibility. German patrols, airgram observers. They had maybe 40 minutes. Daylight exposed them. Fuel gauges were now dangerously low, less than a quarter tank. Morrison came over the radio, increased speed. Webb pushed the Sherman to 30 kilometers per hour. Dangerous on an unfamiliar road, but necessary. Speed was their only protection now. The road climbed gradually up a hillside, engines strained under the weight. Fuel gauges dropped even faster. Then suddenly Thompson saw something ahead. A roadblock, logs across the road, barbed wire, sandbag position. Both sides. He couldn't tell whose it was, American or German. The positions appeared empty, but that could mean anything. Morrison's voice came over the radio with a single quiet word, pray. Thompson felt his stomach tighten as the column approached the roadblock. The logs lay across the road in a rough barrier. Barbed wire tangled between them. Sandbag positions flanked both sides of the road. In the dim pre-dawn light, it was impossible to tell who had built it. German forces often used roadblocks exactly like this. So did the Americans. If the position belonged to the Germans, the Shermans would drive straight into an ambush. If it belonged to the Americans, they were only minutes away from safety. Webb slowed the Sherman slightly as they approached. No one spoke inside the tank. Even the engine noise seemed muted. Thompson leaned forward in the hatch, squinting through the growing gray light. The sandbag positions looked abandoned. No movement, no soldiers visible. That meant nothing. An enemy crew could easily be hiding behind the sandbags, waiting for vehicles to approach. Thompson scanned carefully, looking for any small detail, any clue. Then he saw something, a helmet lying beside one of the sandbags. Not the rounded shape of a German Stahlhelm. This one had the distinct shallow curve of an American M1 helmet. Thompson felt a flicker of hope, but he still wasn't certain. He raised his hand, signaling Webb to slow even more. The Sherman crept cautiously. 20 yards from the barrier now. 1510, the silence felt unbearable. Then suddenly a voice shouted from somewhere behind the sandbags. Hold it. Identify yourselves. The accent was unmistakable American. Relief hit Thompson like a physical force. He raised both hands above the hatch. 4th Armored Division, he shouted back. Friendly. There was a brief pause. Then several American soldiers appeared from behind the sandbags, rifles ready. One of them stepped cautiously. The soldier stared at the line of Shermans emerging from the forest. 12 tanks, he said in disbelief. Where the hell did you guys come from? Thompson exhaled slowly. Long story, he replied. The roadblock belonged to an American infantry unit assigned to hold defensive positions outside Aachen. During the night, the unit had temporarily pulled most of its men back from the road to avoid German artillery fire. Only a small watch detail remained hidden nearby, which explained why the barrier appeared unmanned. Captain Morrison's column rolled slowly past the logs and sandbags. American soldiers stepped aside to let them through. Some stared in amazement, others simply shook their heads. They knew what it meant for a column of tanks to appear from the wrong side of the front line just before dawn. Luck, incredible luck. The Shermans continued down the road toward a nearby supply area. As the sky brightened, Thompson could finally see the surrounding terrain clear for the first time. Low hills. American trucks parked along the roadside. They had made it. At last, the column reached the supply depot. One by one, the Shermans rolled into the staging area and shut down their engines. The sudden silence felt strange after hours of constant engine noise. Webb turned the ignition key. The engine died with a low rumble. Moments later, he tried to restart it. Nothing. The tank was out of fuel, completely empty. Same was true for the rest of the column. They had burned every drop reaching American lines. It was now just minutes before sunrise. Thompson climbed down from the turret. His legs felt stiff and weak after hours inside the tank. Nearby, Captain Morrison spoke with an American logistics officer. Both men glanced repeatedly at the 12 Shermans lined up in the depot. Eventually, Morrison walked back toward Thompson. For a moment, he simply looked at the homemade compass still clutched in Thompson's hand. Smile. 60%, he said quietly. Thompson shrugged slightly, felt more like 10%. Later that afternoon, Morrison filed the official after-action report. The report described the compass failures inside the forest. It mentioned Thompson's improvised navigation device. It described the near encounter with the German Panther Patrol and the discovery of the massive German staging area. Division headquarters read the report. They noted it, filed it, and moved on. No new regulations were issued. No formal recommendation that tank crews carry improvised compasses. The official conclusion simply stated that the unit had encountered a rare magnetic anomaly. Future operations would avoid similar terrain whenever possible. In other words, the Army considered the incident unusual but not important. Thompson kept the compass. He taped it back inside his map case, but he never needed to use it again. The 4th Armored Division soon left the Hürtgen Forest region entirely. They pushed eastward into Germany through areas where magnetic interference was less severe. Standard compasses worked normally there. The strange little device became more of a curiosity than a tool. Something the crew occasionally joked about. The war continued. The fighting remained brutal. The Hürtgen Forest campaign itself would become one of the longest and bloodiest battles fought by American forces in World War II. More than 30,000 American soldiers were killed or wounded there. Many of them lost in dense forest terrain where navigation mistakes could easily lead men into enemy positions. But those losses were rarely blamed on compass failures. Official reports usually attributed them to poor visibility, confusing terrain, or simple battlefield chaos. Navigation received little attention in the official lessons learned from the battle. The reports focused instead on artillery coordination, infantry tactics, and supply logistics. Thompson survived the war. In November 1944, he was promoted to technical sergeant after another action during the fighting near Bastogne. He eventually received a Bronze Star. The citation mentioned leadership under dangerous conditions and initiative during a navigation crisis behind enemy lines, but the details remained vague. Many of the specifics stayed classified for years. After the war, Thompson returned home to Pennsylvania. He found work as a machinist in a tool and die shop in Pittsburgh. He married, raised 3 children. Rarely talked about the war except with other veterans who had experienced similar moments. The homemade compass stayed in a small box in his garage. Alongside his medals, a few photographs, and some faded wartime letters. In 1993, Thompson died at the age of 71. After his death, his children donated many of his wartime belongings to the Patton Museum at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Among them was the compass. Today it sits in a glass display case, a simple piece of cardboard, a small mirror glued to its surface, a sewing needle balanced carefully on a pencil eraser, string and tape holding everything together. A tiny handwritten note beside it explains that Staff Sergeant James Thompson once used this improvised device to guide 12 Sherman tanks safely through enemy territory after every standard compass failed. The placard does not mention that the compass originally pointed the wrong direction. It does not mention that luck played as much a role as skill. It simply describes the device is an example of battlefield improvisation, a reminder that sometimes the simplest tools can make the difference between life and death. Modern armies rely heavily on advanced navigation systems. GPS satellites can locate vehicles anywhere on Earth within a few meters. Magnetic interference rarely matters anymore, but technology can fail, signals can be jammed, satellites can be destroyed. And when that happens, soldiers still need to know something as basic as which way is north. Even today, the U.S. Army still teaches basic compass navigation during training. New recruits learn to read lensatic compasses. They practice dead reckoning, they study terrain association, but few of them ever hear the story of a homemade compass built from scrap materials that once guided 12 tanks through one of the most dangerous forests in Europe. Perhaps that story remains mostly forgotten because it does not fit neatly into official doctrine. It was not perfect planning. It was superior equipment. It was a desperate decision made by one ordinary soldier in a moment when everything else had failed. 12 tanks, 63 men, 4 hours behind enemy lines, one crude compass made from cardboard, glass, and a sewing needle, and against all odds, 0 casualties. A mission no training manual could have prepared them for.